we're ready, I want to just read something from Exodus 19, and then I'll just stand out there and talk on some things, and hopefully you'll talk with me. Exodus chapter 19, this is 3 days before Exodus 20, when God comes down on the mountain and speaks out of the fiery cloud the Ten Commandments. 3 days earlier, God had called Moses up to the mountain to speak to him. And I want to read God's words. Exodus 19, verse 3. And Moses went up unto God, and the Lord called unto him out of the mountain, saying, Thus shall you say to the house of Jacob, and tell the children of Israel, Ye have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bare you on eagle's wings, and brought you unto myself. Now therefore, if ye will obey my voice indeed, and keep my covenant, then ye shall be a peculiar treasure unto me above all people, for all the earth is mine. Now, let me just stop and connect on that. If you'll obey my voice and keep my covenant. Now, he hasn't made a covenant with them yet. Not with this generation that's just come out of Egypt. And he's qualifying that he's the Lord who has brought them out of Egypt, and I've brought you unto myself. Now, he hasn't said that to any group of people prior to this. I've delivered you from something to bring you. Well, yes, Moses has told you we're going to a promised land. We're going to the land of Canaan that Abraham used to live in. But I want to make a covenant to bring you unto myself before I take you to the land of promise. And what's the covenant going to be? Well, it's going to be the 10 things he says in 3 days' time out of the cloud in the hearing of every one of the people. But he goes on, verse 6, And ye shall be unto me not only a peculiar treasure to me above all people, but you shall be unto me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. That's the end of God's speaking in this passage. And then he adds, these, what I've just said, these are the words which you will speak unto the children of Israel. I was in a conference in Tennessee a few weeks ago, and I made the point that I often make here, that God never called himself a king or mentioned wearing a crown or sitting on a throne all the way from Adam's time to Samuel's time, roughly 3,000 years. It wasn't until Samuel's time that it is first said, if you people want to have a kingdom and have a king ruling it, why didn't you at least ask God to be the king? And that is the first reference in the Bible of God being a king. Now, I pointed that out on my way to making another point. So, well-known Bible scholar was there, and he approached me afterwards and said, I want to refer you to Exodus 19, where God calls them to be a kingdom of priests. And he said, God would be the king, and they would be his subjects, priests. And I had to counter and say, well, no, sir, I don't see it that way. I'm sorry. God didn't say he would be the king. He said they would be a kingdom. But he didn't call himself the king of it. We don't read of this kingdom of priests again in the entire Old Testament. God never says again, you'll be a special treasure, a peculiar treasure, a peculiar people unto me. a kingdom of priests, and a holy nation. That is never said of them again until St. Peter writes it in his epistle and is now talking to the church. A priestly kingdom and a holy nation that won't be repeated again until then. And then we'll have in the book of Revelation where Christ by his blood, and this is mentioned twice in the book of Revelation, Christ by his blood has made us to be kings and priests unto him in the earth. So I think that's another reference to the priestly kingdom or the kingly priesthood. But actually, it's kind of oxymoronic. A kingdom of priests. They kind of cancel one another out in a particular way, because we have seen kingdoms prior to this that I've just read. There was the kingdom of Nimrod. We read of a fellow named Melchizedek, who is both king and priest, the priest of the Most High God and the king of righteousness and king of Salem. We also read of the kings of Mesopotamia that Abraham has to fight, and the king of Egypt that Abraham visits, and we read of the king of the Philistines, Abimelech, and others prior to this. But all of those references, except the Melchizedek one, speak of a king as a ruler, as the ultimate supreme commander. A king, it's called a kingdom because it is a monarchy ruled by a king. But God describes something completely different. A kingdom of not generals, not warriors, not rulers, not tax gatherers, but a kingdom of priests. And that's very different. What is a priest? A priest is a connector between, it's the word Kohen in Hebrew. It's the connector between the divine and the human. A priest stands to connect God to man and to connect man to God. The priest faces the people representing God in order to bring God's blessings and pardon to them, just as he faces God representing the people behind him as he brings their sacrifices and prayers to the Lord, thus connecting God to man. My thinking is that this is God's original statement about what kind of nation they are to be. He says, we've already read in it, a verse or two before, that you're going to be unlike all the other nations of the earth. I've called you unto myself. This is my vision and my plan for you, O Israel, children of Israel and sons of Jacob. You people will be different than any other people on the earth, and here's why you'll be different. You will all be priests. And he says, for all the world is mine. All the earth is mine. God is not throwing away the rest of the world. But here's a nation in which every individual will be a connector between man and God. Each individual will be a priest. I just felt something touch me again saying that. This is God's plan for them. And it's a beautiful plan. And I think God means you will pick up again as an entire people what I called Abraham to do as an individual from the start. I sent him to the kings of the earth. And I can give you a list of all the different kingdoms that Abraham went to bring his understanding of God to them. And it really wasn't done after Abraham. Now God is saying, all of you will do that as a collective nation. You will be the priestly nation to the rest of the world. And you will bring me to the other nations, and you'll bring the people of the other nations to me. This seems to be God's beautiful, poetic, and succinct description of his vision for the people of Israel. Did it ever happen? And the answer is basically no. St. Paul says, well, what was the value then of Israel? What good is it to be a Jew and an Israelite? And his answer is, well, in one thing chiefly, that unto them were committed the oracles of God. We have the Old Testament from their writers and prophets, but we never see them as a whole people touching the rest of the world in the way God said. In fact, almost from the start, something different happens. He shows up on Mount Sinai and he says, now Moses, I'm ready to speak to them. And I hope they're ready to listen. We can read through the rest of Exodus 19 and you'll see all the things that Moses tells them to do to prepare for God's arrival on Mount Sinai. But when he does arrive, and Moses has tried to get everything ready, God speaks the 10 covenant promises that are not called the 10 commandments yet. They're called the 10 promises of the covenant. They won't be called the 10 commandments until later God writes them in stone and then tells Moses to lock that writing up in a box and tell people if anyone touches that box, they'll fall dead, much less open the box and read the words he wrote. But they can have a special group that can carry that box around on posts, staves slid through the rings of it. And it's not called the Ark of the Commandments or the Ark of the Law. It's called the Ark of the Covenant. This is God's original covenant that he wanted them to follow. But immediately upon hearing these words, the people, as I point out quite often, they turn and run away. It's quite interesting. God speaks all of those 10 things to individuals. He never says ye, the plural second person pronoun, which would mean all of you. King James, ye. All y'all, as we say in the South. He says thou. Thou shalt. And thou shalt not. Now, thou is the singular pronoun. One person. You, just you. Not you and you, but just you. God is speaking to individuals with all 10 of these statements. And yet, the people, not one of them remains standing before God's mountain saying, here I am. They all look to one another, and they all decide instinctively in kind of a herd mentality to turn and run away. And they stand afar off. They, it's plural. They stand afar off and they cry out, not to God, but to Moses, and they say, we. Now, God hasn't spoken to all of them. He's spoken to each of them as an individual. If any man among you will hear my voice, if just one of you will, then that will bring my blessing for the whole nation and give me the hook to work with all of you. So I'm speaking to each of you right now. But they respond in the plural. They say, Moses, tell God not to speak to us, for we are afraid. And Moses goes up and speaks these they words to God. Here's what they say. And God said, all right, I want to have an individual covenant with each of them that will make all of them my kingdom of priests, but they've got to each come into my holy covenant. None of them want to, so we're going to have to do something different. Forget the 10 commandments. I'll write them on a stone. You lock them up in a box and tell people never to read them. Instead, Moses, get out your pen and start writing on paper. Now, the rest of the law, God says, not to the whole people, but to Moses only. and then you go down and read it to the people. Now to me, that's really something. And that becomes what they have to follow, a bunch of rules, instead of being in heart-to-heart covenant with God. And that is why, by their decision, a number of things have happened. Now, last Wednesday night, I was talking about, just in certain aspects, I picked out the 7 big ones, where God did not get his original will. Instead, somebody said, let's not quite do it that way, God, let's change it a little bit. And God says, well, all right, we'll do it your way. Maybe one day we can get back to my way. Now, I picked out 7 of those things to talk about. God really didn't want them to have a king. He wanted them to be a different kind of kingdom, but they want a king like all the other nations. Not something unique and different, but like the others. God says, it's not what I want of you, but that's what we'll do. Let's see how long it lasts. I mentioned that God never did want a priestly tribe, the tribe of Levi. He wanted all 12 tribes to be priestly in the statement we're looking at right now. All of you. God never did want to have a high priest family, the family of Aaron. He wanted them all to be priests before him in high priest fashion. They would each be a high priest unto the Gentiles, the other nations. But we end up with Aaron. God, and I pointed out, God never did want the tabernacle for his presence to dwell in. God wanted them to be his tabernacle, that he would dwell within each of them. But instead, they've got to have an artificial dwelling place for God. What do you mean by artificial? It's a fancy word that really means man-made. They put it together. Well, of course, God gives them the plan, but how to do it, but it's not really what he wanted to start with. I went further last week and said that I'd like to point out that God never really chose Jerusalem to be the capital city of settled Israel and its kingdom seat. God had said he wanted another city, and I'll get to that, not tonight, but I'm just making my list. And lastly, and this is very strong, God didn't want the temple to be built at all, and said so in a number of ways. So when I make statements like that, none of you reacted adversely to it, but I've made statements like that out teaching in other places. I can see that it kind of just blows people's hair back. God said Jerusalem is the city that I have chosen where I put my name. That was after David conquered the city of Jebus, renamed it Jerusalem, and asked God, can this be the capital? Can I build a temple for you here? God had earlier said, there's somewhere else I have in mind. And David went to that somewhere else, a city called Hebron, and we'll talk about it. Not tonight, but later. And David dwelt in Hebron for 7 years. And a lot of things happened at Hebron. But then David goes, God doesn't tell him to, but he goes and conquers this mountain and asks God, will you let me have the kingdom here? And God voices some objections to that, but says, okay. Now I'm through with my list. I may not get to any point in that list tonight, but I want to also point out to you that this kind of tells the whole history of God from the very beginning of the Bible. Isn't it something? God speaks the potential of what should be and hands that potential to a man or a group of people, and they accept the potential, and then they fail to live up to it again and again. And yet God keeps dealing with them. And as I mentioned as we were closing last week, Stephen brought up some excellent questions and comments about this. God saying, here's what I want. This is my will. Oh, you don't want to do it? Well, I still want to work with you. Can we do it some other way? Oh, that's what you want. Well, we'll do it your way for a while, but it's not going to work, I'm telling you. When can we get back to my way, my will? Now, from the very start in the Bible, we're only 2.5 chapters into the Bible. Everything's going right. God creates the universe and says it is good. Everything's good, 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 good. He looks at man and says he's good too, but it's not good that he live alone. Let me make him, this is God's idea, not Adam's. Adam doesn't put his hand up, and at least we don't read of Adam saying to God, you know, boy birds have girl birds, and boy dogs have girl dogs, and even boy snakes have girl snakes. But I ain't got nobody, and nobody cares for me. Well, you don't know that old song, but anyway, Adam doesn't go complaining to God. I want a wife, I want a woman. God brings it up. God looks upon Adam and says, it's not good for man to be alone. I will make a helpmate for him. It's all God's doing, God's idea. Now, somebody said that's where the trouble began, women. Well, the woman is part of the man. The man is part of the woman, bone and flesh. They are the same. Perhaps mirror opposites of one another, but there's nothing intrinsically wrong with either of them. But things go wrong. Based on various theologies, this is the fall, or at least it is the sin. It really doesn't seem to be such a huge sin to me if all it is eating a piece of fruit off a tree. God could have slapped their hands and said, now don't do that anymore, I told you. But instead, he drives them out of Eden over it. And we have now what many theologians call the doctrine of original sin. We are all conceived with that same hell-bound sin upon us unless we get redeemed by Christ. Now that's quite a terrible punishment for one little action of sin. If the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was an actual tree with actual fruit, or if it symbolized something bigger and more mystical, I won't go into that. But it sure does seem to be a terrible thing to do to the entire human race for one moment's action with Eve and Adam. Now, you can describe that all you want, but it doesn't sound like what God later told Moses. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a hand for hand, foot for foot, wounding for wounding, burning for burning, life for life. Now, what does all that mean? He means the punishment must fit the crime. If somebody pokes your eye out, the worst punishment you're allowed to give them, bringing them to court and demanding vengeance upon them, the worst vengeance you can demand on them is that their eye be put out. If someone knocks your tooth out, the worst you can demand be done to them for the sake of vengeance is that their tooth be knocked out. If they knock your tooth out, you can't cut their foot off. You can only cut their foot off if they cut your foot off. Am I making sense to anyone? The punishment must fit the crime. This is the lex talion, the law of retaliation, which doesn't say you have to put the guy's eye out. It's saying, it's limiting. The only thing you can do to him if you want vengeance is put his eye out. Now, God demands this, but God himself doesn't seem to follow it. They ate a little piece of apple, and he says, now I'm damning the entire human race to hell unless individuals will approach me and come into personal covenant with me. Ooh, that's just horrible. But things went wrong. Am I making sense to anyone? God did not get his way. I stated last week that I like to make the statement just to make people sit up and stare at me. God is the least person in the universe or in history who gets his way. He is the least one to get his way. If God got his way, Adam and Eve, we suppose, would not have been driven out of Eden and would not have gone to that tree or listened to that whispering, inveigling serpent. Seems like the devil wins in that one. If the serpent is the devil and God loses, doesn't get his way. But the serpent's over there, I messed it up for him. Well, see, I don't like that. I like to see God as all powerful and all good and all righteous. So where is God going to get his way? Where is his will going to happen? Well, things get worse and worse and worse and worse until God has to make the statement. God says, I repent that I made man to start with. I'm going to wipe it all out, except for one guy in his family, Noah, who is perfect. And God wipes out the whole human race and says, we're going to start all over right now with you, Noah. Okay, this is God's new will. Does God get what he wants? No, he says to Noah, as soon as he steps out of the ark and offers sacrifice to God, God smells the sweet savor of the sacrifice and comes down to talk to Noah. And he says, you know why I wiped all of them out? It was because the imagination of their heart was only evil continually. But now I look at you, Noah, and your sons, and I can say nothing has changed. The imagination of the heart of man is still only evil continually. That's kind of God saying, all right, now this is plan B. And I'm going to start all over with you, Noah, but I can tell you, I'm going to hint strongly to you, it's not going to work. And Noah lives those 350 years after the flood to see humanity coming from him becoming just as bad as humanity was before the flood. Something fails. By the time we get down to the bottom of the list of Noah's descendants and the nations that came from them, we meet a fellow named Abraham. And God says, now I'm going to speak my will to Abraham, and we're going to start everything all over again, but in a different way. I'm not killing everybody on earth again, but I'm going to send Abraham to them with a special covenant presentation. Well, it worked pretty good in 3 or 4 situations Abraham found himself in. But then Abraham dies. A couple of things don't seem to have gone right. Maybe he shouldn't have gone with Hagar and produced Ishmael. Maybe he shouldn't have had those other sons after Sarah died. Don't know. We can argue that. But when we look at his grandson Jacob and his 12 sons, man, things are messing up with those boys. And Jacob, Abraham's grandson, on his deathbed, gives a prophecy to each one of those sons' families, which will become tribes. And only 3 or 4 of those prophecies sound really good, mostly to Joseph and Judah. But we see there have been things go wrong in Judah's life, and he had a way of redeeming himself with God. I won't go into what it was yet. And he receives a great prophecy. But as we come on down through the Bible, they go into Egypt. They remain there for a long time. God tells them what's going to happen to them beforehand. Finally, he raises Moses up and says, okay, bringing Abraham into the land of Canaan didn't work. Things went badly, not the way I wanted them to go, but we're going to redo it now, Moses. And you're going to take them in to the promised land. Did it work the way God wanted it? Well, in some ways, yes, and we like to preach about the good things that happen, you know, the Red Sea and the fall of Jericho and the amazing things, and Joshua having the sun stand still in the sky for the space of a day. I mean, just amazing things that happen. Those are the positives we want to look at. But if we look at the overall picture, things don't go the way they should have gone. I've already told you Moses leads them out of Egypt and they reject God's covenant. Instead of a covenant, God gives them the law. And he says, now it's spoken not with hope but in a threat. Break one of these and I'm going to kill you. And the laws, 600 some odd laws, including precepts and ordinances. You break one of them, you're guilty of breaking all of them, and I'm going to kill you, and I'm going to destroy you and scatter you to the nations. You'll go out fat and then become skinny. You'll lose everything. You'll see your sons and daughters taken from you and become servants of other nations, and I will abandon you. This is what he's saying at the end of Deuteronomy. If you don't keep this law, something's not going the way God wanted it to go. As we look back through the books of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, we begin to see what they were. This is not what God wanted. All right, they've wandered through the wilderness for 40 years. They weren't supposed to. God had taken them to the edge of the promised land and said, go on in, and they balked, and he said, okay. For every day that I spoke to Moses on the mountain, you will wander a year in the wilderness. For the 40 days, you'll wander 40 years until you are all dead in the wilderness, and then I'll bring the next generation. God didn't even get his will with Moses. Moses made God mad, and God said, for that, you won't go into the promised land either. Well, the new generation goes in under Joshua. We've never been this way before. And they're a stronger generation. God says, well, I don't have to baby feed you. And the manna stops falling every day, and the cloud by day and fire by night. God says, I'm taking that away because now you will go in and possess the land. You're strong enough to do it, and I provided everything for you. Well, we come into the Joshua and Judges period, and things begin to go badly. And I pointed this out before. In Judges, you know, we've got, 20 judges come along in a succession. Some of them do some good, some of them do not. It goes up, it goes down, up and down. And when I say doing good, I mean judging the nation, teaching them righteousness, and maintaining righteousness among them. None of the judges succeeded in that from Joshua on down. Moses was probably, we could call him the first judge. He didn't even succeed in making them the law-abiding people that God's going for now. Am I making sense to anyone? I thought I'd be getting some interruptions so far with questions or comments. Things don't go the way they should over and over and over again. We can see it in the lives of some individuals. God says to Adam, an individual, you will be the image of God on the earth and among men. Adam failed at that pretty early on. God says to Samson, you will deliver Israel from the Philistines forever, and you will establish a victory. Well, Samson dies without accomplishing that. He's going to be the strongest man, and it looks like he's got the potential to be the strongest man, but becomes as weak as all men. And that potential is squandered. David comes along. He's going to be a man after God's own heart, but he fails to live up to that. And on and on, we can look at individuals who fail. Solomon comes along. He's going to be the wisest of all men. Well, he fails in wisdom and becomes just as foolish as all men. We can keep going in this kind of list. But even with individuals, God doesn't always seem to get his way. Not with all of mankind, not with a chosen nation, not with chosen individuals. Things fall apart. I don't know if you've ever read Yeats' poem, The Second Coming. He describes things fall apart. The center does not hold. Things are whirring out. He's writing this during World War I. And mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. A blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. And what does he mean? He means God's original covenant with us in a wedding ceremony, the ceremony of innocence, our covenant with God. You got it, Dad? Okay, all right. That's been drowned. And the poet looks at all that seems to happen over and over again, where God's covenant is violated and not followed, and now the whole world is falling apart once again. And the poet, Yeats, says, surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. Now that's all of the poem's lines I'm going to quote to you. But it seems that when things fall apart and the center doesn't hold, humanity looks around all the time. We look around at our families failing. We look around at our friends failing. We look around at our government failing. We look around at failure, our best efforts. We try to come into covenant with God and call God on the scene, and he gives us some victories, but then after a while things fall apart. And the only thing we have left, either to be in despair over things going wrong, or to step aside from all that and look up and say, God, you have to come into this. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. Surely God's going to come again among us and do something great. Well, as we follow through the Old Testament, I'm not going to say God fails to get his will, but God doesn't get his will because the people he's working with fail him. It's a great picture in Jeremiah chapter 18, where Jeremiah says, I went down to the potter's house to watch the potter work a work of clay upon the wheel. And he made it. He turned it, this lump of clay, he brought it up as it spun. He dug his thumbs into it and threw out, they call it throwing in pottery, threw this lump of clay into a beautifully shaped vase or a bowl. And then, as he's taking it off the wheel, it cracks. Before he can even get it to dry in the oven, it already cracks and crumbles. The clay is marred in his hands. And God speaks to Jeremiah and said, you saw that? That's me and Israel. I'm the potter, they're the clay, but they won't measure up to what I want to produce them to be. So all I can do is crumble them down. And that's when God begins to speak to Jeremiah. I'm going to destroy them with the Babylonians and crush them down to nothing. Well, I hate to tell you, Jeremiah, but this isn't the first, you're not the first person God's told this to. This has gone on again and again and again and again. Everyone seems to fail at the potential God gives them for their life. But don't despair. Surely some revelation is yet at hand. Now, speaking of the list that I made, things that went wrong beginning at Mount Sinai, here's God up on the mountain saying, I'm going to change your very character in 10 different ways, you know. And you'll be different people because I'm speaking to you. And of course, they all run off. Now, the first thing they chose, God wanted them to come to Him and be embraced by Him. I've brought you out of Egypt to bring you unto myself. You and me, each one of you. I'll embrace each one of you, and you will embrace me, and we'll have a personal relationship. Father and Son between each of us. The people say, no. You can have that relationship with Moses, and he'll tell you, God, what we want, and then he'll come down and tell us what you want. So what they're choosing now is a special office, the office of the national prophet, to communicate between them and God. So they stand Moses up there. Here he is, the connector between God and Israel. And God didn't choose him for that. God just chose Moses to go to Egypt and get Israel and bring them out to the same place, to the same fire Moses had been called at. And they would all know God the same way Moses did. The people say, no, let Moses be the one guy. And so the office of the prophet is initiated. Are you following me? God didn't choose that. They chose it. Let me turn it kind of sideways so I can go down the line a little bit. Let's say God is here on Mount Sinai, and He says, all you people, I want to embrace you. They say, no, get Moses to touch you, and he can touch us. He can be our prophet, our go-between, our communicator between us and you. So now they are 1 degree of separation away from God. They got Moses between them and God. It's not what God wanted. Well, Moses gives them laws. Immediately they start breaking the laws and need redemption. So now God institutes a second office. Here's God, here's Moses. Now here's Aaron and the Levites. A priesthood. The priesthood's job is now going to be to atone for their sins. Because they've broken the commandments of Moses the prophet, now they need an atoner for their sins. And you can't get to Moses without coming through Aaron. You've got to go through the high priesthood and sacrifices at the tabernacle and all that before you can even hear what God has to say concerning the law. And you've got to live up to the law before you can touch God. Well, they really began to mess up not only in being atoned, but even their priests began to mess up badly. By the end of the book of Judges, and of course we see the wicked high priest, Eli at the beginning of Samuel and so forth, the priesthood messes up. So now they need something else. Because they're messing up, they're going to need some very forceful teachers of the law, judges. So now we've got the prophet, the priest, and the judge. We see that the judges failed to bring the people to God. Am I making sense? But you've got to obey the judges before you can be atoned by the priest, before you can be blessed by the prophet, before you can touch God. You are now 3 levels of separation away from God. Now at the beginning of the Samuel, the judges, that hasn't worked out. So they come to Moses and they come to Samuel and ask for something else. Make us a king like the other nations. God says, I don't want to, and you're not going to like it, but we're going to do it. So He sets up the kingship. There'll be some good kings, some poor kings, some mediocre kings, but all in all, the entire 450-year kingdom period will not work. It comes to an end. And when it does, there is no more 12 tribes of Israel. When the kingdom ends, there's no more throne of David. and the kingdom ends, the temple has been destroyed, it can be rebuilt, but it won't be rebuilt in their land or in their city. Why not? Because Jerusalem is no longer their city. What had been the land of promise no longer belongs to them. It belongs to the Babylonians, then the Persians, then the Greeks, then the Romans. They never own the promised land again, even when we get to the end of the New Testament. It's not theirs anymore. Everything has gone wrong. Now by 70 A.D., the rebuilt temple's going to be destroyed, and 2,000 years later, it hasn't been rebuilt yet. They've even lost that, and God causes them, as He said He would, to be scattered to the four ends of the earth. Everything has gone wrong. Things fall apart. The center doesn't hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon all of it. Some revelation must be at hand. I think the poet's really onto something there. Then a child is born. Who is he? Matthew says, well, I'll give you all of his genealogies. From Abraham, Abraham begat Isaac, Isaac begat Jacob, Jacob begat Judah and his brethren, and Pharez, and Judah begat Pharez, and Pharez begat, and when we come on down the line, and we've just looked at all of this, God's chosen people, His peculiar people, above all other people, they have distanced themselves from God by 4 levels of separation. Don't talk to us, talk to a prophet. We can't do everything the prophet tells us, so we need a priest to atone for us. Well, all right, but unless you get atonement by the priest, you can't get back to the prophet. And unless you obey the prophet, you can't get to me. Well, all right, well, we'll do right. They don't, so now we need a judge to work over us. Well, with a judge, your relationship with a judge is you're the convict and he's the judge who sentences you. Not as good. 3 levels of separation. And then we come on down and they've asked for a king, and the kingship brings it. But what have we got? King, judge, priest, prophet, all between us and God. We've got to fulfill the obligations of the king, and then the judge, and then the priest, and then the prophet. Fulfill all of those before we can step close to God, and none of it has worked. Well, this child is born. He's a descendant of all that. We think so, because Matthew begins by saying the generations or genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And we're saying, I just finished reading the Old Testament. I'm not interested in a son of David. All the sons of David ultimately messed up. I'm not really interested in another son of Abraham. All these people came from Abraham, and they all messed up. Matthew, you want me to read about a son of David and a son of Abraham? Well, I'll give you the list, and he gives us the genealogy and all those generations. And then Matthew stops and says, now the birth of Jesus Christ was on this wise. Whereas there was a man named Joseph espoused to a young girl named Mary. And behold, she was found with child. Oh yeah, the whole story we know. Begat. Some man begat a child in this woman's womb. Nope. She was found with child of the Holy Ghost. Not begotten by Judah or by Jacob or by Isaac or by Abraham. Something stopped. And this is the last big kickstart God's going to make. I tried starting it all over with those people. Now I'm starting it all over with this one man. And Jesus comes along. And he comes to the king, David. He says, David, nice try, but you didn't live up to be the king I called you to be. So you can step aside, and I'll take your position and be the king. And then Jesus steps up to a judge like Samson or a judge like Gideon, any of the judges, and say, nice try, boys, you all tried. You can go sit down. I don't hate you, but you did the best you could, I guess. But now I'll take the robe of the judge upon me. He's wearing the crown of the king, now the robe of the judge. And then Jesus steps up to the priesthood and says, Aaron, you and all your brood, go sit down. Let me have the priest's garments also on top of all this. I'll be the high priest. One man. And then he steps up to Moses and said, Moses, you tried, I know. But your prophecies didn't work. Talking to man on God's behalf. It didn't work. Even you, the prophet, didn't work ultimately. But you know what? I'll not only be the prophet now, I will be the prophecy. And now all of those step out of the way, and here's Jesus touching God and calling all of us, come unto me. Come unto me, you who are burdened and heavy laden. Come and don't just come and let me be between you and God. I'll do that. The one mediator now between God and man. One mediator. Not Moses, not Aaron, not Samuel or David, but only one mediator fulfilling all of those. It's being compressed into Jesus Christ. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely this coming is at hand. Am I making sense to anyone? And he says, but I don't even have to be the mediator. Once you come to me, all ye who are heavy laden, burdened and tired and heavy laden, come up around and stand beside me and take my yoke upon you and walk next to me. And we will together approach God. No longer a degree of separation between us and God. Because Jesus isn't the separator between us and God. He is now, what God always wanted, the connector and the presenter. And Jesus says, because I've been prophet, priest, judge, and king, I will make all of you to stand with me and sit with me in my Father's throne. Also, as prophets, you say, wait. Oh, Moses had said, I would to God that all God's people were prophets and did prophesy. Well, now, you're all prophets. Anyone who has the testimony of Jesus Christ has the spirit of prophecy. Hallelujah. Now we're all kings. Now, because of him, we're all considered by God as his priests. And not only that, we all stand and he calls us to be the judges. Don't you know you will judge angels? He says to the people in his redeemed church. So someone asked me, said, you know, Brother Pat, when I hear you preach the Old Testament, it seems depressing. You just make the Old Testament sound so bad. I'd rather come to hear you when you're talking about Jesus. James was telling me this, somebody had said recently about my preaching. But Pat's good when he's in the New Testament talking about Jesus. But when he gets into the Old Testament, boy, it's dim. It's dark. It's gloomy. Why doesn't he preach about Jesus Christ? Well, ladies and gentlemen, every story I see in the Old Testament points to Jesus Christ. It is all, you can't even look back through history through the lens of Jesus, which will take you back over all the Old Testament by seeing that all of it was about Jesus Christ. Because he is what it all comes to. God says, I chose the strongest man, he failed. I chose the wisest man, Solomon, he failed. I chose the most noble man, David, he failed. I chose the holiest man, Moses, he failed. They've all failed. Now proving that the best fail. Well, if all the best fail, where does that leave the rest of us? It leaves us just saying things fall apart and the center doesn't hold. Then we turn and say, surely some revelation must be at hand. Otherwise, why are we even here on this earth? And the revelation is Jesus Christ. I'm finished for tonight. Anybody got anything they would like to add or question or challenge or say? Now is your time or forever hold your peace. I don't want to hear about your complaints. Speak now. No, I'm joking. But that's the way I picture the Bible. I need to stop. Peter, standing before the high priest council in Acts chapter 3, says 3 times, all of the prophets from Adam downward. And he says all the prophets from Samuel and on. And then he says, in fact, all of the scriptures, all of that out through there, it all predicted the coming of this man, Jesus of Nazareth. He's the meaning of all the Old Testament. And if I ever preach an Old Testament story and fail to make it understood that I'm using it to point to Jesus Christ, then I have failed in my diction and my delivery. But I want you all to know tonight that it all comes down to nothing if it's not going to bring forth Him, the one who does not fail where all others failed. Thank you very much for your attention tonight, Brother James.